This exhibition, Surreal and Unreal, has an interesting genesis, actually. Initially, I intended to create an exhibition on surrealism, rather strict fashion. But in looking at our holdings, the gallery's holdings, and looking at the range of what we had, it suddenly became clear to me that surrealism has informed virtually all aspects of modern and contemporary art. And this conversation is a much more interesting one than the sort of manifesto and limited group of the surrealists themselves. The exhibition indeed includes some of the original surrealists, but expands all the way through the present time. And there's an adventure in this conversation. The interesting thing, though, is in discovering that surrealism was really introduced in a very large way by the Museum of Modern Art on December 9th, 1936. That exhibition had a similar sort of approach in being presented, because as we now present this work from the early years through the present day, they were doing the present day all the way back to the 15th century, including artists like Hieronymus Bosch moving forward to visionaries of the late 19th century, the symbolists and so forth, and then ultimately the Dada movement, which really broke into the revolutionary realms of modern art approximately during World War I, and then the Surrealist movement as we think of it today in the 20s, 30s, and to the 40s. So this exhibition is a fascinating overview, in a sense, without manifesto. When that Museum of Modern Art exhibition was presented in 1936, the Surrealists had not yet been in America. American artists knew somewhat of the sensibility by virtue of publications. There were exceptions of artists that were shown here, the Europeans. Miro in particular, he had a significant impact in introducing biomorphic abstraction. But there were American artists responding in extraordinary fashion. They were the exception to the norm, but here we have this amazing example of a painting so sophisticated in composition and paint handling that it's really quite remarkable. This painted before that Museum of Modern Art show. Dated from 1936, this is a painting by Hans Burkhardt. Burkhardt, Swiss-born, came to America in the mid-20s, befriended Arshile Gorky, and shared his studio for the better part of 9 years. This painting, done in Gorky's studio, in fact, the studio that they shared, shows a sophistication that is genuine. One sees composition of this invented planet. Titled Voyage on the Metasola, it was an escape to other worlds, because the world that these artists were residing in wasn't a very comforting place. And escapes and dreams were very much in sync with the motivations of the surrealists and meant so much to these artists. Burkhardt here shows the beginnings of what proceeds into expressionism, and we see aspects in this painting that are very prophetic. This area here, this bravura of brushstroke, one could almost take that detail and think of it as a 1950s or 1960s painting, because it was prophetic to the abstract compositions that he was dealing with at the time. Burkhardt left New York at the end of 1937. Late in 1937, he creates this painting in Los Angeles. Again, a remarkably sophisticated abstract painting of this biomorphic scene entitled Day and Night. Dated 1937-38, this has to be among the earliest, if not the first, abstract surrealist work painted in Los Angeles. Hard to even fathom that this level of development existed here in LA. Some years later, after Burkhardt comes to Los Angeles, we see a masterpiece done by Alexander Calder. We know Calder for his mobiles and drawings and gouaches, but paintings on canvas are particularly rare. But specifically, here we see a pure surrealist landscape. Now, Calder was one of the very few American painters who actually had direct linkage with the surrealist artists early on. André Breton didn't come to America until the early 40s. Arshile Gorky is often thought of as the first abstract expressionist and the last surrealist. These are cliches that are never quite accurate. But indeed, those Burkhardt paintings are painted before André Breton and Mata and the rest of the European artist exiles come to America to escape World War II. The exhibition has some interesting conversations between artists, even in advance of their actually meeting. Here we have a work by Stanley William Hayter. Hayter is one of the most interesting and obscure artists of the period, in a sense, and yet perhaps one of the most critical figures in terms of directing modern art in a whole new way. And let me explain that. Hayter was a great printmaker, a British artist, moves to Paris, establishes a print studio entitled Atelier 17. And at Atelier 17, all of the artists in the day in the 1930s went to Hayter's studio to learn engraving and etching and learning from him how to create some of their most important prints. Hayter came to America in 1940 approximately, 39 or 40, and immediately is hired by the New School for Social Research in New York City. There he taught a class called Atelier 17. And because he had already engaged all the surrealist artists, all those exiles during the beginning of the war came to New York, were introduced by Hayter to American artists. And in fact, Hayter established lectures that introduced the concepts of the surrealists. André Masson's automatic drawings, for example. In that lecture that he gave, who would be in that audience but people like Jackson Pollock and Motherwell and others who were introduced to the tenets of automatism and the subconscious, really directing young artists in a new direction. So Hayter is a bit of a linchpin that has not properly been acknowledged for that purpose, but in fact, he's very well acknowledged as one of the historic figures of the 20th century in terms of printmaking, but in fact has that significance of being that catalyst that introduced surrealism to an entire school of artists in New York City. On either side of this painting are works by Claire Falkenstein. Now, we see certain parallels both in composition, we see it in palette, and so fascinating because Claire Falkenstein, who is the sculptor from the Bay Area, originally from Coos Bay, Oregon, but was working in the Bay Area with a number of artists who had a fascination with surrealism, she worked with Hayter in the 50s, but in fact, here we have paintings, two paintings, one from 1941 and one from 1945, showing an astounding amount of sophistication and competence for an artist, a woman working in San Francisco who would ultimately be meeting Hayter, working with him, and yet you can see they're in parallel, absolutely synced in parallel, simultaneously apart from each other by thousands of miles without ever having known each other. And we see that connection throughout the exhibition with this biomorphic abstraction in particular. One of the artists that came to New York from Paris was the young Chilean painter Roberto Montanez. He was among the youngest of the original surrealists and one of the last to join the movement, to join André Breton's movement. He went to Hayter's studio at the New School and created his very first etchings. This entire series that he created at the New School was so provocative in its sexual content that he could have never published them in 1943 when he executed them. It would have been an impossibility. The plates were ultimately lost. He had actually printed a few proofs, but never editioned. And the plates were lost. And then in 1979, Mata found 7 of the plates. The following year, he found the other 3. The plates were corroded, he cleaned them, and he published these etchings for the very first time, and then created a new etching to serve as the frontispiece of that series of works titled The New School. Approximately 1980-81, I was in the process of hoping to commission Mata for a project and learned of the availability of these rare, important works. Who could have believed it? Because all we knew were of those proofs from a few history books on surrealism, and they had never been seen. And I was fortunate enough to acquire the remain of that edition and today exhibit them for the first time in Los Angeles in their totality. The edition now resides in many, many museums throughout the world, but here we are with this on view in this exhibition. Mata's introduction to Hayter and Hayter's guidance can even be seen in some of these works, particularly some of the effects that one sees in these white embossed areas in some of these compositions. This is pure Stanley William Hayter. This is his technique where it is the illusion, an area without ink has the appearance of being whiter than the paper itself. One of the aspects of this exhibition that I'm particularly proud of is that in this day and age, the media, art magazines, the buzz is all about works of art that are hugely expensive, millions of dollars, and I don't think aspiring collectors really understand that there is a cultural legacy, a cultural patrimony that is available to us at very modest levels, and I think it's important that we understand this. Here, for example, is an etching, a small engraving actually, by Dorothy Daynard. Dorothy Daynard was an important sculptor, the wife of David Smith. Women were not getting their due. And here we have this etching, which I was given as an invitation to her 90th birthday, in fact, and it literally is something that is in the Museum of Modern Art's collection, by the way. And I researched the title of this, entitled Skating, which Dorothy Daynard did in 1953. This is a work of art, worthy of being in the Museum of Modern Art's collection. It's priced, and I don't generally talk about the price of works, but I think it's important that we honor these artists for the work they've done. And the fact that it's $350 does not diminish its importance any more than a short story would be of a great novelist or a couplet by Shakespeare. An aspect of the exhibition is also to key upon aspects of our history, Los Angeles history for that matter, and New York history, in the case of this artist, Frederick Kahn. He was one of the founders, one of the original members of the American Abstract Group in New York. Prior to that, he had won prizes and shown with very important artists of Paris. Comes to Los Angeles approximately 1940, opens a gallery, in fact, called the Circle Gallery. Something that one has almost no record of is the fact that Frederick Kahn tried to organize champions of modern art, abstract art in particular, to form a group equivalent to the American Abstract Group, and he called it the Open Circle. The name of his gallery was the Circle Gallery. And the open circle included people like Man Ray, Hans Burkhardt, Bertoya, but other artists like Eugene Berman and some names that perhaps don't come to mind at the moment. There exists even a little invitation, an acknowledgement written by Man Ray. He exhibited Man Ray in Los Angeles. There's almost no record of Frederick Kahn's significance and importance in championing art here in Los Angeles and in America. Indeed, even when the American Abstract Group was featured as a major book, somehow Frederick Kahn was left out. And yet, in the original manifestos that were written by the American Abstract Group, Frederick Kahn wrote an essay entitled In Defense of Abstract Art. At the end of World War II, there were a group of artists that were born out of Surrealism in Vienna and founded a school of really fantastic art. Fantastic art is a descriptive, not only an adjective, it is a noun. This school of fantastic realism that was founded by artists such as Erich Brauer, who is very much still painting today, creating incredible works. This from 1960. We see the kind of jeweled, almost oriental qualities that, because there's really, Vienna is indeed on that border that separates Europe and the Orient. And it's an amazing painting that harks back to indeed those early Renaissance works of imagination, early Renaissance. At the end of World War II, there was a young group of painters that became known as the Cobra group. These artists from Copenhagen, Brussels, and Amsterdam, thus Cobra, the acronym for the main centers of the Cobra, they all met in Paris, actually. Most of them met in Paris at a Surrealist conference after the war. But their own ideas of needing something more primal than the intellectually driven, manifesto-driven Surrealist movement. They were interested more in indigenous cultures, antiquity. They were also interested in the works of children and the mentally deranged. And so they formed this notion of a movement that reflected these more primal, surreal, but expressionist sorts of sensibility. Many artists not associated with Cobra worked and sympathized with them. Many will tell you that Cobra may be the last great movement of the 20th century. And the reason that would be argued would be there were Cobra poets, there were Cobra authors, there were composers, painters, sculptors. It really was a comprehensive movement, seldom seen in modern art. The formal movement only existed between 1948 and 1951, but the artists themselves stayed true to that sensibilities as they separated from the formal group itself. There was Karl Appel, many would say Appel. Karl Appel represented the Amsterdam portion of Cobra. Pierre Alashinsky, shown here, was from Brussels and represents the BR. There were others, of course, from those cities. But Cobra had an international impact. Artists such as Osvaldo Vigas, who's a very important Venezuelan painter, became immersed in that sensibility when he went to Paris for the first time in the early 1950s. So we see Cobra as being centered in places that we normally may not think as the great centers of 20th century avant-garde, but yet their impact was international. Cobra's impact extends even today. We see an artist here, Peter Lindbusk, an artist little known in America, but making considerable impact on those occasions shown at international art fairs. He's, in fact, cited as one of the most extraordinary upcoming artists of Europe. And here we see this painter creating this ceramic sculpture. It's a horse and rider, really. It's evocative of that. But we see the kind of impact of Cobra. We think about artists perhaps such as Dubuffet. It's evocative of art brut. So we see this continuum throughout. As we move through this exhibition and enter into works of the later 20th century, certainly the 60s and forward, we see how the aesthetic of the Surrealists have informed so much art that we engage every day, and that conversation continues. It's not about manifestos. We've been liberated from the realm of the real and entered into both dreams and projections and expressions that the Surrealists have given virtually every modern artist. Here we have an example of Jordi Alcaraz, an astounding contemporary artist. Just when we think we've seen it all, we see this young, poetic artist. We see this artist bending materials and projecting ideas. One actually captures a process of an idea, and it's done with an aesthetic that is rather staggering. We have a sense of familiarity, but we're seeing something that we've never seen before. Jordi Alcaraz is a true surrealist, but above all, he's a visual poet. He is a visual alchemist. One of the exciting things about presenting an exhibition are the surprises, particularly of artists that we may not be familiar with. Here's a wonderful example. Brandon Bello J. When I came upon an installation of his work, I was so deeply moved. Bello J is a scientist, an artist, and he searches out old prints, and his knowledge of animals and insects is rather remarkable. He seeks out prints that depict, in this case, a butterfly that is extinct. It's about extinction, it's about loss, and what he has done here is to cut out the butterfly, which is no longer part of our world. That paper is then burned. He created a funereal urn with the name of the species that no longer exists. The work itself is framed in period decor. This kind of Art Nouveau frame echoes the last time this species has been seen on this planet, and that was in Jamaica in 1890s. So there's something very touching about the preservation of something that was precious to this world, as this great environmentalist and poignant artist has given us here. In this work by Bruce Richards, we see the melding of conceptual art, art history, contemporary painting, and really echoing several periods and artists, and how this continuum of art history is rather remarkable. The legend of Pygmalion and Galatea speaks to the sculpture that was so beautiful that its maker fell in love with it, and the gods brought her to life. Magritte was moved by it, and here we see something where Bruce has echoed Magritte's painting in the dissection of the figure to bring even more focus upon her. And he's here making reference to Marina Abramovich, who did a very famous performance where she carved into her abdomen and bled this star. The title, Before and After, speaks to that ancient history, modern history, and contemporary history, but the title itself is drawn from a painting by Andy Warhol that spoke to an advertisement of plastic surgery showing before and after. The influence of Magritte has been rather consequential to contemporary art. Artists ranging from Ed Ruscha to Gordon Wagner. Gordon Wagner was indeed a beachcomber. He collected objects and detritus, things found on the beach, and made these amazing assemblages. But he was a true follower of Magritte, in fact, in his paintings and drawings. But a huge inspiration to artists such as Ed Kienholz and George Herms. George Herms was part of that beat generation, these artists that took discarded objects, objects that had a life, a prior life, organizing them in some poetic fashion. And is this really emerged out of Surrealism? The exhibition is too vast to key upon all of the wonderful moments in this show, but we are left with this conversation that is ongoing. It's about creativity, it's not about doctrine. And I'm so excited to be able to share this exhibition and see collectors discovering old friends as well as new in these presentations. The poetic mark-making of Patrick Graham, the ironic humor in many instances of Ed Ruscha, of George Condo, of artists such as David Hockney, remarkable photography of Joel Peter Witkin, truly an extraordinary and unique photographer in this 20th century realm of image makers, of tableaus, equal to his extraordinary identical twin brother, Jerome Witkin, who in our case, perhaps we've pushed the notion of surreal and unreal into hyperreal as he depicts the remarkable scenes of 9/11. The exhibition opens up a conversation, and I hope that one might view these works in the proper context that they should be viewed. They are not limited to a moment, a doctrine. They each have followed a journey that began going back to Hieronymus Bosch and through the symbolists, Victor Hugo, Odilon Redon, Duchamp, Magritte, Miro, etc., etc. And I think we have some discoveries that deserve being made here, and particularly how American art, particularly after the war, was spurred by Surrealism.